Today we're going to be discussing Saul, the Benjamite, the very first king of Israel. Saul is very important for a number of reasons, but how he got to become king is also incredibly important. The build-up is crucial. Well, let's go all the way back to the days of Moses, hundreds of years before Saul ever became king. Well, Moses, he's told, go into Egypt and tell the Pharaoh, free my people, let my people go. The Pharaoh does eventually allow the Hebrew people to go after the plagues and the Passover. He then has another sudden change of heart and pursues them all the way to the Gulf of Aqaba, or as we would know it as the Red Sea, but it's a section of the Red Sea. And then that's where God parts the waters, and after the Hebrews cross, the waters come back and kill all the Egyptians. God then guides the people all the way to Mount Sinai, where he gives them the Ten Commandments, they make the golden calf, as well as the Levitical laws. And we all know what transpires. That initial group that came out of Egypt, there's only two that's actually allowed to go in to the promised land because God wants them to go in right away. But they wind up having a lack of faith. They want to go back to Egypt. So God says, all right, you're going to spend 40 years out in this wilderness in a roundabout way. And then Joshua eventually leads them in shortly after the death of Moses. We're then told about the death of Joshua. And then for the next 400 years, they have no king over them this entire time. Over the next 400 years, God, he sets up these judges over Israel, starting with Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, all the way down to Samson. And you may be asking, well, what is a judge? Well, it's a basic military leader as well as a spiritual leader. And what they would do is they would fall into disobedience, idolatry, into the ways of the Canaanites, and then God would give them over unto their enemies. He would take that hedge of protection down and allow the enemies to come against them, and then they would eventually cry out unto God, and God would send a judge unto them like Samson, Gideon, Deborah, whoever. But what's the difference between a judge and a king? Well, a judge earned his own living. While judging God's people, he was in a sense one of them. But a king had privileges and riches and dues, etc. He was above them. A king is above them and ruled over them. Once again, the time of judges lasted over 400 years. It's then that we read of Samuel the prophet. After Samson, we read of Samuel the prophet being born in 1 Samuel 1:20. Now, it's the book of 1 Samuel where Saul is introduced. Now, remember, Samuel was the very first son of Hannah. She couldn't bear children for many, many years, and suddenly she prays unto God and says, Lord, if you give me a son, I'll dedicate him totally to you. So the Lord gives her Samuel. The prophet Samuel is then raised by the high priest Eli, who had two evil sons, Hophni and Phinehas. One day, Eli's sons are killed during a battle between Israel and the Philistines because they say, bring the Ark of the Covenant. That way the Lord will be with us during this battle. So Hophni and Phinehas, they escort the Ark. They come with the Ark and they wind up dying in the battle. The Philistines take the Ark of the Covenant. And whenever Eli is told of his son's death, as well as the Philistines taking the Ark of the Covenant, Eli then falls backward in shock, breaking his neck in the process and dying. He was very old, and we're also told that he was very heavy. The prophet Samuel then becomes the leader of Israel, more a spiritual advisor than anything else. After many years, Samuel begins making preparations for his two sons to lead Israel after his death. Samuel's getting older and older, so he's setting up his two sons, but the people reject Samuel's sons as they were not like Samuel. His sons were also corrupt and greedy and evil. Beginning in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people beckon the prophet Samuel to anoint for them a king. so that they could be as all other nations of the world. This request greatly angers the prophet Samuel, as God was their king. But God tells Samuel to do as they request, but warn them of the consequences of their decision. In essence, to anoint a king before God divinely sent them one, because that's what they're wanting. God is meaning for David to be their first king, but they're saying, no, give us one earlier. So the Lord gives them warning through Samuel, and the warnings go like this. Their king would take their sons for war, their daughters for cooks, their fields for his servants, their vineyards for his officers. All would become servants to this king that they're requesting. The people they agreed and persisted in their desire for a king. It is in 1 Samuel chapter 9 that a man named Saul of the tribe of Benjamin is introduced. 1 Samuel 9 verse 2 describes Saul as, and I quote, a choice young man and a goodly. And there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. From his shoulders and upward, he was higher than any of the people. In other words, he had an athletic build, and the scholars believe that we know that he was very tall. He was taller than all the other people. He was even probably close to 7 feet tall, they believe. He was probably also rather handsome. He's, in appearance, everything that you would want in a king, outwardly. Saul, along with a servant, this is how the story begins with Saul. Saul, along with a servant, are seeking his father's donkeys. Once again, Saul dwells within the land allotted to the Benjamites. He lives within the land of Gibeah, within the Benjamite land. And right here's a graph that shows the trek that he takes while looking for his father's donkeys. He and his father's servant, they eventually make their way all the way to the area of Zuph, which is where Saul tells the servant they should return to Gibeah, but the servant says they should rather inquire of the prophet Samuel as to the whereabouts of the donkeys. Saul agrees. They then find Samuel, who had already been told the day before that he was to encounter this man Saul and anoint him king over Israel. The prophet Samuel then tells Saul to stay with him and partake of the sacrifice that he was having at Zuph. He then tells Saul not to worry, his father's donkeys had been found. The following day, because Saul stays with him that night as well as his servant, the following day Samuel anointed Saul, then told him to go to Zelzah to retrieve the donkeys, then to go further where he would encounter prophets. Saul and his servant do then travel to Zelzah, where 2 men tell him that his donkeys have been found. They then go a little bit further where 3 men offer them food. They then travel to the high place of Gibeah, Saul's hometown, where he does indeed find the prophets and begins to prophesy himself, being filled with the Spirit of the Lord at this high place of Gibeah. Now notice how God changes the heart of Saul before making him officially the king publicly, which is what happens soon after, where the prophet Samuel then gathers all of Israel's representatives together at Mizpah, where he announces Saul as their very first king publicly. Though many rejoiced at this announcement, there remained a divide among the people, as some did not believe Saul could save them from their enemies. So the Lord, through Samuel, has now given Israel their very first king, but he's not really identified completely as their king until he wins a great victory. 1 Samuel 11 then tells us how the Ammonites, across the east of the Jordan, how the Ammonites invaded the Israelitish country of Jabesh Gilead. Upon hearing this, Saul sends word to all of Israel to gather an army for retaliation. Saul even cuts up 2 oxen, sends their several parts throughout the land, threatening all that refuse his commands will have their oxen done in the same manner. In other words, their livelihood would be cut off from them, because the oxen, that's how they plowed their fields and grew their crops. We are then told how 300,000 Israelites assemble at Bezek for King Saul. They then go to war against the Ammonites, ending with a great victory, and the people all agreeing that Saul is truly their king. So everything is going great for Saul in the beginning of his reign, but soon after does it begin to slowly deteriorate. 1 Samuel 13 then tells us how in Saul's second year as king, the Philistines gathered themselves to war. Now, this would be to the other side of Israel. The Philistines gathered themselves to war against Israel after Jonathan, Saul's son, attacked one of their garrisons. Now, the Philistines had long oppressed Israel, and Israel greatly feared the Philistines. That's actually where Goliath is located. They have giants within their army. They have an enormous army. And upon hearing that Jonathan, after Saul makes his son Jonathan one of the head captains or even one of the main generals over his army, Jonathan then takes a troop and attacks one of their garrisons, one of the Philistine garrisons, and this sparks a great war. Because the Philistines then hear about this attack and they gathered their enormous army together and they all come to Michmash, which is right in the area of Saul's hometown. 1 Samuel 13 actually tells us how many Philistines are gathered. 30,000 chariots, plus 6,000 horsemen and foot soldiers, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. So the Israelites, as well as King Saul, they take a look at this enormous army coming to destroy them, and they all begin to flee. They run mainly across the Jordan to the east within the land of Gilead. But Saul, he has 600 men still left with him. The rest are hiding in caves, and they want no part of this because they don't really even have weapons. They're basically farmers with, farm tools and clubs, because the Philistines, they outlawed blacksmiths within the Israelite land to keep them from rising up against them, which King Saul is attempting to do. But Saul, he's encamped right here at Gilgal. And he is told to wait 7 days for the prophet Samuel to arrive to offer sacrifice unto the Lord and to receive instructions, as the Lord will give them a great victory. But after the 7 days, Samuel doesn't show up right away, and Saul, they're all in great fear. But the Philistines, they're not attacking Saul and his army because they don't see them as any kind of threat. So the Philistines, they begin to send these 3 small troops out in order to just plunder the land. They're just going to start taking things because, once again, they're not afraid of Saul and his little 600 men. They could just annihilate them with no problem, they think. So Saul, he then says, after the prophet Samuel doesn't show up immediately on the 7th day, he says, "Bring me the burnt offering and communion offerings." Then Saul, which this was not his place. The Lord ordained that Samuel offer these sacrifices, that the priest offer the sacrifices. But Saul takes it upon himself to sacrifice the burnt offering. As he finished sacrificing the burnt offering, right as it's finished, Samuel arrives. The prophet Samuel then rebukes King Saul for his disobedience to God. He then informs him that God has chosen another man after his own heart to be king. Now, a lot of people say, well, Saul is rebuked twice, and he's told this twice, like he loses his kingdom twice. We're about to come to that second instance, but there's a huge difference in what's happening right here. Remember, this is in Saul's second year. He's a young king. He's fearing, he's trembling. God takes all of this into account, and this is really much more of a warning. This is a threat sent out to Saul. We'll come to that right here in just a second, but I want for you all to keep in mind, this is a young King Saul. Both the king and Samuel then journeyed to Gibeah, having joined forces with Saul's son Jonathan and his men, awaiting the Philistines' next move. And once again, attempting to draw Saul out of his fortification, the Philistines began sending these 3 groups of lightly armed men throughout Israel for plunder. It's then that we're told about Saul's son Jonathan and his armor-bearer leaving the company of Saul to scout out the Philistines, because remember, they have these small groups going out to plunder. Finding one of the smaller outposts, they go up and kill some 20 men, just the 2 of them. Panic then sets the Philistines to believing Israel has surrounded them with ambush parties. This is no doubt the work of the Lord, especially the very next event that happens. This sudden panic within the Philistine camp is followed by a sudden earthquake, we're told. which causes the Philistines to flee. Suddenly there's this divine intervention that they can tell is happening. King Saul, along with the Israelite army, then began pursuing after the Philistines, killing many of them along the way, because remember, the Philistines, they're not up for a fight now. They're all in panic. But Saul gives this very foolish command to his army. King Saul then forbids any man to eat anything until the Philistines were no more in Israel. You're not allowed to eat all day long, basically, while fighting and running. But Jonathan, Saul's son, did not hear of this foolish command to not eat all day and began to eat honey in front of some of the other troops. When the men rebuke him and tell him of his father's command to not eat anything until the battle was over, Jonathan then replies something very telling about his father at this time. Jonathan is letting us in on what God sees in this King Saul. Jonathan himself says of his father, "My father hath troubled the land. See, I pray you, how mine eyes have been enlightened, because I tasted a little of this honey." Notice he says, "My father hath troubled the land," so he knows already that something's not right with Saul. He then continues, "How much more, if haply the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies which they found? For had there not been now a much greater slaughter among the Philistines if the people were allowed to eat along the way of the pursuit of the enemies?" Because it's many miles back to the Philistine land. And the point that I'm trying to make by showing that quote from Saul's own son is how Saul is not thinking rationally. He's not a great king. He's really not. You'll see that along the way. After the battle was finally over, the men were exhausted and starving, manically eating fresh killed oxen, sheep, calves, blood, and all. And remember, Israelites are not allowed to eat blood. It's forbidden. King Saul then rebukes his men for eating of the blood. He says, "Oh, you've sinned against the Lord," but it's his fault that they did it. And this is common with Saul. He never does take personal responsibility, whereas King David, he immediately blames himself for everything. And that's the huge distinction between David and Saul. Saul then built his first altar for the people to sacrifice unto God upon and to partake of meat without sinning. Saul then looks at his exhausted army and tells them that he desires to continue pursuing the Philistines. But the priest advises that they should seek the will of God first, which they do, but there is no answer from the Lord. Saul then believes God's silence is due to someone's sin. Well, someone has sinned apart from this eating of the blood. Something else has happened because the Lord isn't talking to us. He then has lots cast and makes another rash oath that whosoever the culprit may be will be swiftly executed. It's then that Saul finds out about Jonathan partaking of the honey whenever he had given strict orders, "Do not eat anything until I've avenged myself of my enemies, the Philistines." So he finds out about his son eating of this honey, which leads Saul to sentence Jonathan, his own son, to death. But the people refused to allow this, as Jonathan did nothing wrong and God had used him so mightily that day. Some years later, after a considerable time and increase in Saul's power and experience in war, does chapter 15 tell of God commanding Saul to destroy the Amalekites. The command was unique to others, as this war would be in fulfillment of an old prophecy from the time of Moses, when the Amalekites attacked the Israelites once they began their journey in the wilderness. The Amalekites were actually the very first people to trouble the people in the wilderness. So it's expected of Saul to fulfill that prophecy. Saul then gathers over 200,000 soldiers in Telaim. And then he goes and warns the Kenites to flee from the Amalekites, as their people, the Kenites, had always shown great kindness to Israel. For example, certain Kenites were Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, his brother-in-law, Hobab, as well as Jael, the Rechabites, etc. From Telaim, he then attacks and gains a great victory over the Amalekites, but spares their king Agag, as well as the best of all their livestock. He was supposed to destroy every bit of the Amalekites. The Lord then tells Samuel of Saul's continuing disobedience, which causes Samuel to confront Saul the following day. Now remember, Saul, he has some experience now as king, and he's taken more and more liberties as the years go on. It's then that we read in 1 Samuel 15:20, "And Saul said unto Samuel," the king says unto the prophet, Yea, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and have gone the way which the Lord sent me, and have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. See, Saul, he always tries to justify his disobedience. He then goes on to blame his army for the transgression. But the people took of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the chief of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God in Gilgal. And Samuel said, Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. Now this is the second rejection of Saul. Once again, the first one happened when he was a young king. This one's happened after years of experience. And to this second rejection, the old Bible commentators in pulpit commented, God does not finally reject a man until after repeated opportunities for repentance. He finally proves obdurate. David committed worse crimes than Saul, but he had a tender conscience, and each fall was followed by deep and earnest sorrow. Saul sinned and repented not. The prophet's words in 1 Samuel 13, whenever he's first rejected, were a stern warning, and had Saul taken them to heart, God would have forgiven him his sin. He repented not, though, but repeated the offense, and so the sentence was then confirmed. God waits, therefore, till Saul has had some years of success and power, and his character has developed itself and is taking its permanent form, and then again gives him a trial like this Amalekite war, and then again gives him a trial in order to test his fitness to be a theocratic king. Chapter 15 then continues after this final rejection of Saul. And as Samuel turned about to go away, Saul laid hold upon the skirt of his mantle, and it rent. And Samuel said unto him, The Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and hath given it to a neighbor of thine that is better than thou. Then said Samuel, Bring ye hither to me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came unto him delicately, very softly and cautiously. And Agag said, Surely the bitterness of death is past. And Samuel said, As thy sword hath made women childless, so shall thy mother be childless among women. And Samuel hewed Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. And Samuel came no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord repented that he had made Saul king over Israel. Now, as you'll notice, he returns back to Ramah, his hometown up there. And Saul's hometown is Gibeah, right there's Jerusalem, and right down here's David's hometown of Bethlehem. And as you'll see, they're all in very close proximity. Also, notice the nuance within this verse, how Samuel doesn't come to see Saul anymore, but later on, towards the end of Samuel's life, the very final days, it seems, Saul does go and encounter Samuel one final time whenever David is on the run. Let's also give one extra note on this King Agag of the Amalekites that Samuel just killed. It is believed that some 500 years later, Haman from the book of Esther was a descendant of King Agag, as he, Haman, is then called Haman the Agagite. It's also believed that Haman's archenemy within the book of Esther, Mordecai, Esther's cousin, was of some distant relation to King Saul. So is there a possible contradiction to be found here? Many skeptics claim that Haman could not have been a descendant of King Agag if all the Amalekites were destroyed at the time of King Saul. But not all the Amalekites were then destroyed, only those, as Scripture tells us, from Havilah all the way to Shur. One can easily read how King David attacks other Amalekites years later in 1 Samuel 27 after King Saul. And even later are they noted in 1 Chronicles 4. First Samuel chapter 16 then goes on to tell of God commanding Samuel to go to Bethlehem, where he would find a replacement for King Saul, but he doesn't tell him right away who it is. And we all know the story. I give all the details within our King David study, but this study is focused on King Saul. So let's just skip ahead. Samuel eventually encounters a young shepherd boy named David. And the Lord tells Samuel at that point, go and anoint him to be the future king over Israel. So David is anointed the future king, but in 1 Samuel 16:14, we're told about Saul. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. Now notice, this evil spirit is sent by the Lord himself. The Lord is so displeased with Saul and his disobedience that he sends an evil spirit to vex Saul. And more than likely, this just started to drive him mad, as we'll see coming up how he just acts so irrational all the time. And he's just up and down this roller coaster ride of mental anguish. So King Saul is vexed by this evil spirit, and this leads his servants to then tell him of David, who was known apparently for his gift of music. Saul then sends for David. David then plays for Saul, resulting in Saul loving David, even making him his personal armor bearer. Now, just a short time later, do we read in 1 Samuel 17, then tells of Israel warring against the Philistines around the valley of Elah. And this would be one of those long drawn-out battles that actually last 40 days. Every day of these 40, the Philistines' greatest warrior, Goliath, a giant from Gath, would challenge the Israelites to a one-on-one duel for supremacy. None would accept for all 40 days. This was a very frightening individual, and it's believed that Goliath was around 10 feet tall. So if you can just picture your ceiling being 10 feet tall and Goliath's head touching the top of it, that's really enormous. Now, during this 40-day period, it's believed that David, he has been sent back to his father Jesse in order to take care of the sheep, while Saul is at war. But right at the 40-day mark is he sent by Jesse, his father, to take food to his 3 brothers, in whom are part of the Israeli army at that time. While there, it's early in the morning, and all of the army is preparing to go out to battle because they wouldn't usually fight at night. So the army of the Israelites are preparing to go out to battle, and Goliath comes out, as he did every other day, and he's yelling and mocking God, mocking Israel, and he's just trying to say anything whatsoever to have them bring someone out. And it's mainly for entertainment purposes, because Goliath, he already knows he can pretty much kill any one of the Israelis. But on this particular day, Saul's young armor-bearer, David, overhears the giant. We're then told how David is perplexed that none of the Israelites have taken the giant up on his offer. He says, he's mocking God. Are you just going to allow him to blaspheme? Have you no faith? So he says, well, I'll do it. So he goes into King Saul and he says, I'll fight this giant. And King Saul, he first tells him, you're just a youth. This man is battle hardened. He'll eat you alive, basically. But David says, I've killed bears. I've killed lions while watching the sheep of my fathers. He said, I've spent years killing much more ferocious animals than this giant. King Saul then says, okay. He then offers David his own armor, but David refuses, as he had never fought in such things before. David then goes and kills Goliath in front of all the Philistines and Israeli warriors, gaining immediate recognition among the two nations. David, he just suddenly goes from being a no-name shepherd boy to being the greatest warrior in all the land. We're then told how afterwards Jonathan, Saul's son, the prince, if you will, became best friends with David. He even gives David his own armor and his own weaponry and everything. It's almost a symbolic feel of, you would be a better king than anyone to succeed my father. Saul soon after promotes David to the leader of his army, or at least a great portion of it. David's fame eventually grew to the point where women would sing a very popular song, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. This caused the king to envy David and to worry about the security of his throne. One day, while David played the harp for Saul, as he had at other times, the king took up a spear in envy and rage and threw it at David, attempting to kill him. 1 Samuel 18:11 tells of how he attempted this twice, but David managed to evade the assault each time. Saul then connives to set David against the Philistines, ordering David to bring him 100 Philistine foreskins as payment for his daughter's hand in marriage. In other words, take this troop of 1,000 that he has set David over, take your troops and go and kill at least 100 Philistines, and he's hoping that David would die in the battle. But David winds up bringing him 200 foreskins, double the payment, as a dowry to marry his daughter Michal. We're then told how sometime after the wedding, Saul attempted to conspire with his son Jonathan and others to kill David, but Jonathan persuaded him otherwise, leading Saul to swear not to harm David. So for a short time, everything kind of settles down within the kingdom. Saul hasn't tried to kill David for a few weeks or so or whatever. And David, he begins to come back into his presence. Not long afterwards, though, while David once again played his harp for the king, the evil spirit, we're told, returned to Saul, resulting in yet another outburst, and Saul throwing his javelin for the third time at David, narrowly missing. And notice how no one calls the king out on this, because he'd probably have them killed. Even the prophet Samuel, right before he went to anoint David in Bethlehem, like we just went over a few minutes ago, even the prophet Samuel, in his prayer to the Lord, he says, "But Lord, if I go and seek another king, Saul will kill me." So obviously Saul, he's just losing it. He's just going crazy. This is not a guy that you would feel comfortable around, especially at this time. So after the king's third attempt on David's life, we then read how David's wife, Saul's daughter Michal, told David to flee through a window or else he would die that night. David flees from Gibeah to the prophet Samuel in Ramah, and Saul then receives word of David's whereabouts with Samuel in Ramah at a place called Naoth. Saul then sends men after David to Naoth, where both Saul and his servants were told. They all eventually wind up there in search of David. But we're told how the Spirit of the Lord comes upon these men, even Saul, just as when he was first anointed king many years before, and he begins to prophesy or to preach, he's filled with the Spirit of the Lord. It's a type of big church service that happened. And my theory is that perhaps this was to remind Saul to remember the former days when he was willing to be obedient unto God. And it was there at Naoth that the very final encounter between Saul and Samuel would officially take place. 1 Samuel 20 then tells of David secretly meeting with Jonathan as he had escaped from the place of Naoth. But he then secretly meets with Jonathan, Saul's son, in order to find out the reason behind Saul so desiring to take his life. Jonathan doesn't believe such to be the case because, remember, Saul had sworn unto him, "I'm not really trying to harm David." This leads Jonathan to find out during a monthly feast that was coming up the answer. David was supposed to be there at that feast, but David says, "I'm not going anywhere around the king." Jonathan says, "Fine, I'll go, and I'll begin to question my father, and I'll find out if he's really seeking to do you harm." So he does go, and Saul becomes enraged at David's absence. Jonathan defends David. Saul then throws a spear at his own son, Jonathan. Jonathan then informs David of Saul's intentions through the agreed-upon signal of shooting a far-off arrow. The two lament, and David flees for good from Saul. Now, this would be a very tragic time in David's life because he's done nothing but good for all the people of Israel. And suddenly he becomes a fugitive within the kingdom, hunted by everyone at King Saul's command. David then flees to Nob, where, in a state of utter desperation, he lies to the high priest Ahimelech in order to gain the showbread, because he and his few companions that are with him, they're very, very hungry. And the showbread was the 12 loaves that they would place daily within the tabernacle. And every morning they would take the old bread and replace it with 12 new loaves. And it's this old bread that the high priest Ahimelech has in his possession. And David says, "Just give me that old bread then." He says, "I'll take it for me and my men. We're starving to death." And then he asks him, he says, "Well, David, why are you here? Why are you not with the king?" Ahimelech doesn't really know the situation between him and Saul and that David's on the run. He knows nothing of this. So David tells him, he says, "Well, I'm on a secret mission from Saul, and me and my men, we're needing bread. So he gives him the bread. And then he asks him for weapons, and Ahimelech says, well, the only weapon that we have here is Goliath's sword that you took. And David says, well, give me that. We're also told how David is spotted by one of Saul's servants named Doeg at that time. Now remember, Doeg at Nob spots David. David then flees from Nob into Gath in the Philistine land, former home of Goliath, where he was almost found out by the king of Gath, causing him to feign madness and flee to the cave Adullam. Saul's servant Doeg then informs King Saul of Ahimelech's assisting David, resulting in Saul having all 85 of the priests at Nob, all the priests of God, slaughtered. He also destroyed the people of Nob, women, children, livestock, etc. Once again, Ahimelech did not even know about David being a fugitive. He knew nothing of this, and this shows the true character and the evil within Saul's heart. He has the whole town slaughtered, along with 85 priests of God. Saul then pursues after David, who flees from Keilah to the wilderness of Ziph to Maon, where the king nearly captures him. Just as we read in 1 Samuel 23:26, and Saul went on this side of the mountain, and David and his men on that side of the mountain. And David made haste to get away for fear of Saul, for Saul and his men compassed David and his men round about to take them. At this time, David, he has hundreds of men that have joined up with him. So Saul comes very close to capturing David and his men. But then we read in verse 27, the following verse, but there came a messenger unto Saul right at that time, saying, haste thee and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land. Now, this seems like an intervention from God, which I think is obvious to anyone in whom reads this. Verse 29 then goes on, and David went up from thence and dwelt in strongholds at En-gedi. After Saul had dealt with the Philistines, he then took 3,000 men to the wilderness of En-gedi, where he, being no doubt exhausted from so many pursuits, felt the need to sleep. David then sneaks up on him and cuts off a piece of his garment. Saul then rose up and left the cave. A few moments later, David yelled out to him whenever he got a little distance from him. David yelled out to him, wondering why the king felt such a need to do him harm, all while showing him the garment he had so recently cut. He says, look, if I wanted to kill you, Saul, if I wanted to take your throne, I could have done it while you slept. Saul responds by weeping, admitting his sins toward David, and acknowledging how David was destined to be king over Israel. And this is the thing about Saul. He's just so roller coaster like. He's evil one second, the next he's repentant. But true to Saul's character, this repentance does not last. 1 Samuel 26 goes on to tell us how the Ziphites again informed Saul as to David's whereabouts in the same relative vicinity as En-gedi. Only this was sometime later after the incident with Nabal in chapter 25, which we go over in King David's study. By this point, we learn that the prophet Samuel has died, David has married Nabal's wife, and Saul has given David's first wife, Michal, to another man. Saul then goes back toward the area of En-gedi, and he comes to a place called Jeshimon. And those similar events in their likenesses, the first encounter which took place at the cave of En-gedi, this second scene occurs in a trench at Jeshimon. Once again, Saul falls asleep, and we're told how the Lord puts a heavy sleep upon all of Saul's men. And then David, he sneaks up on him again, but on this occasion, David does not cut off a piece of the king's garment as he did at En-gedi, but takes both his spear and a cruse of water. He also holds back his nephew Abishai from killing the king, whereas in the initial encounter, there was no such fervent restraint mentioned. And the reason why I'm giving so many details in order to contrast the event at En-gedi is because many believe that they're similar events told by different authors, but truly these are two different occasions where David had the chance to kill King Saul, but he doesn't. David then goes a safe distance away and awakens the king by yelling out to them with Saul's spear and cruse of water in hand, showing him, look, I could have killed you. He begins by yelling at Abner, the captain of Saul's army. He follows by addressing Saul in the same manner as before, asking him why he feels the need to hunt his servant. 1 Samuel 26:21 tells us, Then said Saul, as a reply to David, I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will no more do thee harm. Because my soul was precious in thine eyes this day, behold, I have played the fool, and have erred exceedingly. Then Saul said to David, Blessed be thou, my son David. Thou shalt both do great things, and also shalt still prevail. So David went on his way, and Saul returned to his place. David then fled to Achish, king of Gath, in the Philistine lands, where he and his 600 men would find refuge in Ziklag, because David still does not trust Saul for very good reason. 1 Samuel 27:4 then tells us, And it was told Saul that David was fled to Gath, and Saul sought no more again for David. We're then told how David gains great favor with the king of Gath, Achish, by fighting battles for him against his enemies, not against Israel so much as against other smaller nations. But about a year later, the Philistines amassed an enormous army at Shunem to fight against Israel and King Saul, which gathered at Mount Gilboa. 1 Samuel 28:5 tells us, And when Saul saw the host of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. And when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. Then said Saul unto his servants, Seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, that I may go to her, and inquire of her. And his servants said to him, Behold, there is a woman that hath a familiar spirit at Endor. They're talking about this witch at Endor. Saul then puts on a disguise, because he had forbidden anyone to partake in any sort of witchcraft throughout Israel. And this is once again Saul's character. It's forbidden for you to do this, but it's okay if I do it. He convinces the woman to attempt to bring up the prophet Samuel so that he could inquire of him concerning the next day's battle. 1 Samuel 28:12 then reads, And when the woman saw Samuel, because the Lord actually allowed this to take place, and when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice, because remember, he's supposed to be dead. And I'd say that she's in shock that it actually worked. And the woman spake to Saul, saying, Why hast thou deceived me? For thou art Saul. And the king said unto her, Be not afraid, for what sawest thou? And the woman said unto Saul, I saw gods ascending out of the earth. And he said unto her, What form is he of? And she said, An old man cometh up, and he is covered with a white mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground, and bowed himself. And Samuel said to Saul, Why hast thou disquieted me to bring me up? And Saul answered, I am sore distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God is departed from me, and answereth me no more, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I have called for thee, that thou mayest make known unto me what I shall do. Then said Samuel, Wherefore then dost thou ask of me, seeing the Lord is departed from thee, and is become thine enemy? And the Lord hath done to him as he spake by me, for the Lord hath rent the kingdom out of thine hand, and given it to thy neighbor, even to David. Because thou obeyest not the voice of the Lord, nor executest his fierce wrath upon Amalek, therefore hath the Lord done this thing unto thee this day. And this right here is proof positive that the final straw was whenever Saul did not annihilate those Amalekites. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with thee into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow shalt thou and thy sons be with me. The Lord also shall deliver the host of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. Then Saul fell straightway all along on the earth, and was sore afraid because of the words of Samuel, and there was no strength in him, for he had eaten no bread all the day, nor all the night. We're told then how the woman made Saul a meal to gain his strength, which he at first refused. Then they left while it was still night. No doubt Saul is in the greatest depression he's ever been in his entire life. The following morning, the Philistines fought hard against Israel, slaying all 3 of Saul's sons, even wounding the king himself with arrows. 1 Samuel 31:4 tells us, Then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, Draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. The next day the Philistines found the bodies of Saul and his sons. Whenever they go back to plunder over the dead bodies, they cut off Saul's head and took his armor to be displayed within a temple of Ashtaroth, their false god. They then took their bodies and fastened them to the wall of Bethshan, and this was as a way of humiliating them. Shortly afterward, would some of the men of Jabesh Gilead take the bodies down and bury them? And Scripture tells us how King David would later retrieve all the bodies and reverently bury them in the family sepulchre of Kish, Saul's father.